The trial represented the first time that the Boy Scouts perversion files, those are confidential files maintained by the Boy Scouts of America on pedo files and their organizations, were admitted into evidence. A huge victory. I can say this, I'm a judge, okay? I know that's a huge victory, all right. The perversion files were finally publicly released in 2012, the national and international news coverage. He also successfully won a claim of $11.5 million from the Roman Catholic Church on behalf of victims of sexual abuse. So he's returning here to Nexus to be our keynote speaker, this time to bring us up to the date on the national recognition and action on behalf of child sexual abuse victims. And of course, he's a longtime member of the ICAN Associates Board of Directors. And Paul, I look forward to working with you in the future. All right, so I gotta promise you, this is not a long motion calendar. If someone objects to what you're saying, I will overrule the objection. I promise. You know, because I wouldn't want to sustain it based on what you've done for victims of child sexual abuse. So let's give a big hand.
Well, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Deanne for inviting me here today. There's a picture of me in the Bronx, New York. Growing up in the 1950s there, my 60s.
You were talking then.
Yeah, I detected that in your accent. And you can detect it in mine. I really, again, this is, important for me to be here today. I really appreciate all the work that you do. It's not just lip service because, I work on a different front line than you do, but what you do, I know having to deal with the kids on a daily basis is really not just personally difficult, but you don't really all the time have the support of the folks around you in society that you should. So I've been a children's rights lawyer for about 40 years. The initial work that I did, again, I worked in the most extreme areas. I had a case when I was a young lawyer of a 15-year-old girl. I was working in a juvenile reformatory back in Appalachia. And the young girl came into my office and she told me she was arrested for possession of a handgun because her stepfather had tried to sexually assaulted her. And her first lawyer said to her, well, there was no reason ever to want to pull a gun on your dad, no matter what he did. That led me to a career for between the early 80s and the late 90s, representing abused children who killed their parents. And I have the distinction of probably being the only lawyer in the United States, and according to a couple of other reporters, only probably lawyer in the world that specialized in representing kids who killed their parents. I did that work all over the country, here in California, and then around the nation. There are two kinds of abuse that I've dealt with in my career. Obviously, the kind of abuse was intrafamilial abuse, which were kids who killed their parents, and the other are kids who were abused in institutions. And what the institutional abuse really showed me is something that you don't really see on a day-to-day working in intrafamilial abuse, as many of you do, or neighbors or friends, et cetera. Because most of the people who get abused in institutions like the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, Salvation Army, I can name, the list goes on, they're adults, right? And so when you have a 9 or 10-year-old child who's been sexually assaulted by their mom or dad, by their dad, sometimes by their mom, that you don't really see the long term. You go into court, you say, Your Honor, right? There'll be some bad things that will happen to this person when they get older. They're going to suffer from depression. They're going to suffer from anxiety. But I see men and women ranging from their 30s until their late 80s. I had one case of a guy in his 90s who recounted being abused by a priest in the late 1930s as if it was happening yesterday. And so the sexual abuse in these cases reveals the long-term consequences of how abuse basically, as I say, swallows up its victims. And also because the abuse occurs in these trusted institutions, recreational programs, and we read about them on a regular basis. It's or USA Swimming or USA Gymnastics or any of the Olympic programs, the Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, as the judge pointed out, the Boy Scouts of America, as we all know, the Catholic Church, and I'll be getting into that a little bit more later on. But we see that the scope of these problems, and also all the public schools and private schools, some of you may have heard that one of the most prestigious private boarding schools in California, called the Thatcher School in Ojai, just had a scandal of immense proportions. I'm lucky enough to represent one of the brave young survivors in that case, but where the abuse went on for decades and decades, with a number of victims sexual abuse by administrators and teachers. This is where people are paying $60,000 a year to send their children to the school. So it can happen anywhere. And what we understand is that these hallowed institutions, the ones that are revered by all of us, Boy Scouts of America. I mean, when we had my trial against the Boy Scouts of America, one of the visuals we used was a poster by the famous artist Norman Rockwell of a picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware with a Boy Scout in the boat, where the Boy Scouts of America, the President of the United States, is considered the honorary chairperson of the Boy Scouts of America. And so we're dealing with all these institutions that are trusted. And again, it's schools, churches, etc. So in 19, I'm going to tell you about my journey in that, talk about this, of why this is now an issue that should be and is on the front page of newspapers and front page of sort of our lives. In the late 1990s, I was asked to work on a case in New York against an ex-nun turned elementary school principal, parochial school teacher in a section of the Bronx where I was brought up. And she had sexually abused this 12-year-old boy. And in New York, we're allowed, can't do it in California because I lose my license, but in New York, you can take another person without the other person's permission. It's called a one-party state. So when this young man came to us, we put a body wire on him and sent him in to go speak to the elementary school principal. And we set up the teacher because he had been told this what had happened. And he said, listen, I went to see a therapist and I was listening to these tapes and it was beyond startling. He said, he made up a story. I went to a therapist and they think I was sexually abused. And the principal says, well, you can't say anything. He says, well, what should I say? He says, well, you should say, yeah, this woman had sex with you on one occasion, but she was hit by a bus crossing the street. And so when we sued the Catholic Church in New York, the Archdiocese of New York, prior to that, there was news that this had happened, and all these ribbons went up around the parish fence. It was probably maybe 200 yards long. And as soon as the case was filed and this young man was brave enough to and do an interview about it because he was worried about other victims, all those ribbons came down. But in the late 1980s and into the 90s, we had heard about some Catholic Church cases. There was a case of a Reverend Porter in Boston and a Reverend Gilbert Gauthier down in Louisiana. And we basically thought in the early days that this was a problem of bad apples, that there were just a few bad priests or a few bad teachers or a few bad recreational leaders, a few bad Boy Scout leaders. But then a few years later, some of you may recall the Boston Globe came out with a series called the Spotlight series on the abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston. That led to a movie that won an Academy Award called Spotlight. Some of you may have seen the movie Spotlight, which, and I work with the lawyers and also the reporters who were featured in that movie on a fairly regular basis. But what that movie revealed, at least in the beginning, was that this was not just a problem of sexual abuse with a few priests, but rather it went all the way up the chain. And that we found out that bishops and archbishops and cardinals, because the stories permeated around the United States, even as we all know to here in LA, where the problem was that the priests were moved. If there was a complaint about a priest that was filed by a parent comes in, by a parent came into the bishop's office or spoke to somebody at the diocesan headquarters, that priest was often moved. And unfortunately, I'll get into this in a little while, but even when the Archdiocese of Los Angeles was sued, there were actual specific written records by Cardinal Mahoney, as some of you may recall in the reporting in the LA Times, where there were notes, this priest has to get out of town sooner than later because he may, if he goes to this therapist and reports it, the therapist is going to have to report to law enforcement. And we don't want the LAPD or the LA Sheriff's Office involved. And that was just typical. That wasn't unique. There weren't just a few bad apples in the Boy Scouts, and just a few bad apples in these other institutions, but rather there was an institutional response to this, to these events, to these people. And then we slowly saw between like 2002 or 2003 and then 2011 or 12, we started finding out other institutions, private schools, all kinds of religious organizations, all faiths, from synagogues to Protestant churches, all the way through sports programs. We started hearing again about, as many of you remember, there was a coach at Penn State named Jerry Sandusky, and Sandusky abused boys in full view of other adults who were working in the football program. And in fact, it led to the resignation of one of the biggest football coaches in the history of college football, Joe Paterno. And that was just the beginning of what happened. Then we found out that all of these great athletes that we sent to the Olympics, and I mentioned this a little earlier, who were in our gymnastics program, were sexually abused by the dozens or hundreds by a particular team doctor. We found out that USA Taekwondo, USA Swimming, all of those sports programs also had not just one or two or three folks who were molesting kids, but many more than that. And we knew that the institutional response, these institutions that were there to protect these children, that were there to serve these children, serve themselves. Not surprisingly, unfortunately, the way institutions work, but to rather avoid scandal and to avoid embarrassment, and in many instances worry about how much money was going to go into the plate on Sunday. See, I thought this was going to go off, sorry about that. Anyway, sorry. That, or donations to the school, that they'd rather deep six the complaints, and that's what happened. So over the last 20, really since around 1995, I've worked in probably 40 or 45 states around the country. And I've had the opportunity to represent a whole host of victims, not just people who were, there's this popular conception, which is a misconception, that people who are sexually abused, their lives completely fall apart in terms of their profession. And that's just not true. I've represented combat veterans, teachers, lawyers, doctors, police officers, FBI agents, and all of those people, while they can perform on a certain level in their lives, their emotional lives really are in extreme turmoil. And what's also interesting about the cases that I that I am involved in is that most of the folks who come to see me, it's the first time they've told anybody. And it goes and it proves the point that we know that we're only finding a small percentage of the number of people who are sexually abused in these cases. Because as I've said in the past, that sexual abuse in these institutions, and even sexual abuse in general, is a crime written in disappearing ink. Because the perpetrators know that the victims will be silent, and the victims blame themselves, and that's where the silence comes from. They're either too embarrassed, too ashamed, too worried about what people will think and not believe them if they actually do report. And the perpetrators, and I'll be the first to say this, I never underestimate these folks because they are smart. They know exactly the types of kids to choose in these institutions. They know exactly the types of children who, when they make a move and perhaps just touch their shoulder, the children that move back and the children who don't. And they tend to focus on the more vulnerable kids. And so the reason that I work in civil court to help bring these people to justice is that it is the only venue really where we can hold people accountable for their behavior. In a lot of these cases, against institutions, because the average person that comes forward, that comes to see me in my office, or comes to see any of my colleagues throughout California or around the United States, tend to be older. They tend to, one recent study we commissioned for the Boy Scout case that we have, found that people are in their early 40s when they come forward. And I'll get into this a little while, just to show the scope of it. As a result of my case in Portland, Oregon in 2010, we released these perversion files. The perversion files were files that the Boy Scouts had kept since 1920 about men who had joined the Scouts basically for the sole purpose of sexually assaulting and sexually abusing boys. And up until 2010, these files were kept secret by the Boy Scouts. And we were able to compel them to produce these files in court. And even after they were produced in court, the Boy Scouts lost, they still tried to keep them quiet. And then, as the judge said, the Oregon Supreme Court issued their release. Well, just because of their release, then all over the United States, men started reading for the first time, oh my God, that guy did this leader Jim did do this to me. I'm gonna do something about it. And so as a result, many cases were brought against the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts filed bankruptcy because there were too many cases against them. The largest youth organization in the world came to its feet, and 82,000 men, the size of a small city, filed claims that they were sexually abused. And for those of us who understood the real dynamics of sexual abuse, you will know that represents probably about 20% of the number of people really abused during that time period. And that doesn't cover all the people who had died, and many, many, many people who just were still too embarrassed to come forward. The reason that we go into the civil justice system, unfortunately, is because of this delay. The criminal justice system does an excellent job with young victims, but it's not really put together in a way, or not really configured in a way, I should say, where there could be justice for older victims. When Cardinal Mahoney, during the LA Archdiocese cases back that started in around 2003, 2004, when those cases started, there were all these people that had come forward saying they were sexually abused by priests, and this was all documented in the LA Times. The district attorney's office had very few options for these older victims because the statute of limitations had expired. And it was because these people waited, because of the disappearing ink nature of sexual abuse, all of these perpetrators were basically knew they could went to live their lives without any concern of being arrested. The people who moved them around also had no worry at all about being arrested or having any legal consequences whatsoever. And the reason is because the laws, the criminal laws, were very, very, very restrictive in terms of the statute and when you had to file your case. And as a result, then the only option people had really was the civil court. But the civil justice system at that point in California and around the United States in 2002, 2003, unless the person was a minor, really didn't allow you to sue because you had to really sue within the first few years of being abused. The statutes around the United States change, but basically the statutes basically, if you don't sue by the time you're 21 or 24 or 25, then you're out of luck. So what California did in 2003 is they created a window, a 1-year window in which time people could come forward to sue. And that one window in LA County, there were several hundred people that came forward, 500 or 600 people. Because so many people still were not able to take advantage of that early window, in 2019, the state legislation was signed by the governor, passed a 3-year window, which just ended on December 31st. So people thought, oh, in LA County, against the LA Archdiocese and the Orange County Diocese, they thought maybe those 600 or 700 cases was it. There are 1,700 cases presently in the civil justice system in LA County of people who came forward, 1,700. And so what we know is that these windows, which also have happened in New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, Arizona, and a few other places, these windows actually help people come to terms with coming forward to get justice for themselves. And these windows operate in a way where people have to come in, give specific information about their abuse. But the problem is, in some of these cases, they are so old that there's not a lot of folks left who are witnesses, et cetera. And that does present, obviously, challenges. And I just want to go back to one point. One of the reasons about, in terms of the silencing of victims, that's the whole reason we have mandatory reporting laws. The whole goal of mandatory reporting is that children can speak for themselves, by and large. And when they do, it happens very infrequently. And so that's really sort of the genesis of our mandatory reporting laws. So in California, we know, and around the country, we know that various institutions have been sued, in fact, just in the last 3 years. And it runs the gamut. It's also individuals who have been sued as well, individuals who had sexually abused members of their family, or others who did not get a chance to sue or to even complain or to report when they were minors. And so we have a situation now in California where all up and down the state cases have been brought. And as a result of all these cases in California at the present time, already the Diocese of Santa Rosa has filed for bankruptcy. It's likely that the Diocese of San Diego just announced that they may file for bankruptcy. The other dioceses in California as well have filed for bankruptcy. In New York, all but 2 or 3 dioceses have filed for bankruptcy. The Diocese of Syracuse filed for bankruptcy. The Diocese of Buffalo filed for bankruptcy. The Diocese of Albany filed for bankruptcy. The Diocese of Rockville Center, which is the 6th largest diocese in the United States, filed for bankruptcy. Why did they file for bankruptcy? Because they know that they had all of these priests who had sexually abused children. And that's become the new tactic for these institutions, is to file for bankruptcy and then limit the amount of money that many of these victims will be able, and survivors will be able to get. And unfortunately, as I said, the criminal justice system can't go back in and do anything. For example, in the United States, there's only been 2 jurisdictions where there have been actions, criminal actions filed against individuals where where priests had abused children and it was covered up. But by and large, all of these older cases don't really have a forum in the criminal justice system for them to be able to get the justice for these victims that they need on behalf of the state. And we know that there are in all of these cases where there is abuse in these institutions that, and this is really the tragedy, is that the institution in some way, in most of the cases, has knowledge that the perpetrator is abusing children, and what they tend to do is move the person around or attempt to take that person and move them into a different job where they won't have contact with kids. I'll give you a good example of this. I have a case now which is in the New Hampshire Supreme Court. There's a brother at a high school in Maine had sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl. He was arrested, convicted, and put under the supervision of the provincial, which is in Catholic orders, it's the equivalent of a bishop at that time, and he was put on probation. So several years later, at a school in New Hampshire, he was transferred, but it was an all-boys school, okay? And he's transferred to the all-boys school, but then the all-boys school decides to go co-ed. And my client was one of those young women who was at that school. The school never told anybody about his prior history of abusing children. Never told anybody that he had been convicted of abusing children. In Ojai, California, at the Thatcher School, one of the most prestigious firms in Los Angeles or the state, called Munger, Tolles, Olson, was commissioned to do a report on the sexual abuse scandal in that school. There was one teacher, and the report just came out, who was at a school in Massachusetts in the late 1980s. And at that school was an administrator. This administrator had noticed that this teacher was too close to some of the girls on the soccer team. When confronted, he said, "Well, we're just dating." He was fired from that job, never reported, as typically happens. Never reported, and 5 years or 6 years later, the administrator at that school in Massachusetts was moved to the Thatcher School. This is going to be unbelievable for people to listen to what I'm going to say next. It's unbelievable, and you're going to go. So this administrator is there. This guy who he fired comes to apply for a job at the Thatcher School. He's interviewed by the head master of the Thatcher School, the principal, as well as this administrator, the co-administrator. And they call this guy in, and the administrator who was at this previous school tells the headmaster, "Oh yeah, he got kicked out for having an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old girl. But he's a great soccer coach." They hired him. They hired him, and what do you think happened? How many girls were sexually molested? And if any of you are interested, I sued the Thatcher School. I have a very, very brave client who decided that she didn't want to be a Jane Doe. Most of the people who proceed in these cases go as John Doe or Jane Doe because they still suffer, understandably, from all of the trauma that has happened to them. But she used her name. Her name is Jennifer Burno. And she doesn't mind her name being used. And if you want to see an interview with her, you can go to our website at paulmones.com, and you can see her entire interview. It's around a 30-minute interview with her where she describes what happens. And really interesting is she describes what happened to her as a young woman and the effects of it. And you very rarely get a chance to see that. And why I admire her so much is it wasn't easy for her to come up and to do that interview. But what was motivating her and what motivates many survivors to come forward and become public is to help out other people. But this did not occur in Jennifer's case in the 1960s or 70s or 80s. It occurred in the late 1990s when we were doing ICAN, we were doing Nexus conferences in the 1990s. It wasn't like child abuse wasn't known about. Wasn't like it was a secret. It wasn't a secret. It was a secret, but it wasn't a secret. And so in that circumstance, and that's not atypical. This is what happens. And so the knowledge that these people have, that these institutions place these people in positions of trust and authority, is something that is now slowly but surely changing. And it's changing for the good. So then people ask me, you know, you're just a money-grubbing lawyer. All you lawyers, which is true of a lot of my colleagues. Totally true, totally true, totally true, money grubbers. But the goal of the civil justice system is to get money. Because unfortunately, as I talked about before, the problem is that the criminal justice system can really effectively act in a lot of these cases. Though I will say that in cases that I work on, and I'm representing a number of young people in California now who are still 16, 17, 18, 19, but we work in tandem with the district attorney's office, and I've worked with the LADA in several cases over the last few years in making sure that there's a conviction of that person before there's any kind of civil action brought, because we don't want the defense to basically say, well, the only reason they're doing this is for money. But one of the things that we have learned in these United States is that corporate and institutional behavior does not change unless those institutions and corporations have to open their pocketbooks. Do you think the cigarette companies would have not put warning labels on, marketed to kids, do whatever they wanted to do, unless they had to pay billions of dollars? Do you think that the asbestos companies that knowingly put their workers in harm's way would have abated those asbestos in different workplaces? No. Do you think that in airplane accidents, the reason that airplanes are safer now, you think it's just because out of the goodness of their heart they're making these airplanes safer? No. So it's when there's an accident, they make sure that they change. And so unfortunately, paying cold hard cash is one of the ways that institutions change their behavior. It's just a fact. And so the Boy Scouts of America, when they had to pay $20 million on our case, they tried to change, but they were a little slow on the uptake, and they thought they were. I mean, the greatest, one of the most amazing deposition I took of the head of the child protection section of the Boy Scouts. I said to him, so Mr. Marshall, when did the Boy Scouts recognize that sexual abuse was a problem? He said, what do you mean by the word problem? I said, well, basically, since around 1920, you've been maintaining these perversion files, basically, correct? Right? But we went back and forth on the word problem, and I finally gave up because he would not admit to what it was. But within the Boy Scouts, what we did during the trial was we used these perversion files, and that's not my name. That's not my name, that's the Boy Scouts' name. The Boy Scouts use name, and I know this is going to come as a shock maybe. What color were the files in the perversion file? Pink. Because not just the homophobia that these people suffer from, but there's the outward just disdain for even wanting to deal with the problem. So I went through and, used as we do in court, you have one of these big screens and we have a little laser pointer here. And I went through the files with with a couple of the Boy Scout leaders, and I said to one of them, so let's read this file and you tell me what you think about the response. So the file was from a Boy Scout, a local Boy Scout leader to the national organization, to the one person in the national organization whose job it was to help screen out pedophiles. This is the line, true story. While sleeping in the nude and showing Cub Scouts pornography shows bad judgment, it's no reason to eject him from the Boy Scouts. And so I said to him, well, what's your basic opinion about it? And they jumped and they turned and didn't give an answer. But obviously the jury was absolutely abhorrent. And we went through chapter and verse, we went through file after file after file after file, showing that the Boy Scouts had knowledge that these were single men, that the abuse occurred in their homes or on camping trips when they're separated from their families, that these are Boy Scout leaders who gave favors to favors to these young boys in terms of presents, that the Boy Scouts had a playbook that these pedophiles followed. This is mind-blowing. Back in 1935, the Boy Scouts were called by the media because it was found out they had something called the Red Flag Files. The Red Flag Files were the names of the perversion files back then, but back in the 1930s, there was a communist scare, and so everybody thought there were communists in the Boy Scouts. So when confronted, the president of the Boy Scouts, who was President Theodore Roosevelt's son, he said, oh no, there are no communists, they're just men who joined the Boy Scouts for basically impure reasons. Between 1920 and 1935, 1,000 men were put into the Red Flag Files. And you gotta remember, that's 1920, 1935, which means somebody actually was reporting them. The Boy Scouts had more, according to the FBI, one of their senior agents who was actually one of the founders of the Child Exploitation Unit, the Boy Scouts of America had more information about child sexual abuse than any government entity ever had. And so when we seek money damages, that's just one thing. And I always say, if you want to really see the way corporations would change, let's just say the Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts, the Big Brothers and Sisters used to keep their cash in a big cardboard box on the bottom floor of their offices, and people kept coming in and stealing the cash. How quickly do you think they try to figure out a good system to protect the cash, but not to protect the children? But victims in these and survivors in these cases not just seek monetary damages, but they also seek what we call non-economic damages. Damages such as changing policies, and that's why I'm so proud to represent the people I represent. Changing policies, having more child protection. In fact, one of the things in the Boy Scout bankruptcy, which has about $2.5 billion in it to serve these 82,000 people, that one of the things that was more important for many of the people negotiating the bankruptcy was to get changes in the way the Boy Scouts kept the safety for their children, for the Boy Scouts. And so these monetary demands, including background checks, etc., are also important in these cases. And if we could turn the clock back and make it happen that these people weren't abused, that would be great. But that's just fantasy and dreamland. And so what we have done is we have to go into court to really change this behavior. One of the things when we do go into court, and we are litigating, is that the institutions fight as hard as possible to protect themselves. Most of them. Not all of them, most of them. Which should not be surprising. because they still are interested in protecting their reputations. But what would these people who come into court, survivors and victims who come into court, try to tell and let the juries know is the fact of what has this abuse done to them? And we learn over a long period of time, it affects their self-esteem. People in their 60s, 70s, and 80s talk about this routinely. Many of these folks are still afraid of confronting the abuser, even if the abuser's been dead, because they suffer from traumatic stress disorder. And so they have these intrusive experiences of the abuse. Many of these people can't smell a certain kind of cologne. They can't drive past a church. They can't see an American flag because it reminds them of their Boy Scout oath. Many of them can't sleep at night, or they have what they call somatic disorders, because they have kept these secrets inside themselves for decades, and has destroyed them. It is very, very similar. There's a great psychiatrist who talks about the term soul murder, and you see that in your work all the time. That many of these little boys and girls, you help them out, you try to put some salve on it, you stick your fingers in the dike, you try to prevent the water from coming over, but you know that the suffering is going to continue. And I actually see all of that suffering with these people 30, 40, and 50 years later. And I would suggest to you that in talking, and whenever anybody testifies in court, that the courts get educated about this, that they should know. And many judges now are fairly well trained. The DAs I know it, who do child abuse prosecutions. But the importance of really letting them know the chapter and verse of the long-term effects and even the short-term effects of the abuse. So what's relevant? Why is what happened 30 or 40 years ago relevant today? And I think the reason is that it's relevant today because it shows us the critical importance of being vigilant about protecting kids from abuse, because we see the long-term consequences. We know that there were warning signs that were ignored. We know that there were individuals who knew and shut their eyes and shut their ears. And so we all have to be vigilant about protecting children, because we know even some of the greatest institutions in our country, the most exalted institutions, have had this as a problem for decades. And if we fail to realize these long-term consequences, then in the long run, we won't really be able to appreciate the critical importance. 5 minutes? Perfect, I'll be done in a second. And so there are changes, and I am very happy to say there are changes. The Catholic Church has something called the Veritas program, okay, which all people have to be trained through. Does abuse still happen in the church? Sure. The Boy Scouts of America, up until the time that we sued them, they didn't even mention child abuse in their Boy Scout handbook. I remember saying to one of the Boy Scout witnesses, I said, so you have in here a line about not lighting fires in tents. How many Boy Scouts light a fire in the middle of a tent? Well, I don't know, we haven't had any recently. Okay. But the reason you have is because you're worried about the safety of these Boy Scouts. That's the same reason you have about how to use an axe. Because if you don't use an axe right and you're 10 years old, you're going to chop the kid's going to chop his thumb off or a toe off. But now they have put it in there, and they have part of the parent's protection manual is that your son or daughter, that was the girls in the Boy Scouts, because it's called Scouts America. Now they changed their name. Boy Scouts didn't work. And so now there's greater protections for kids. But to me, it's about accountability, that organizations who were dedicated to the protection of children failed in that role. And it's up to all of us and those of us who are litigating these cases to show them, no, your first priority is for children. I just took the deposition of a cardinal, and I said to him, Cardinal, what's the most important part as your role in terms of children, protecting their safety? Would I have gotten that answer 30 years ago? Doubt it. But got it now from him. And this self-preservation is something that is very hard for institutions to unlearn. And when people say, why do you blame the institution? They didn't abuse the kid. Well, we always say when a tiger gets out of the cage, that's the tiger's job, is to get out of the cage and bite people and cause mayhem, right? But who let the tiger out of the cage? And that's what we ask. Who let the tiger out of the cage? And so that's why the work that we do, all of us do, is we try to keep the understanding that we can prevent a lot of these crimes through education and training. And it's, my rare opportunity in life to be able to do this work. And I thank you all.